as we discuss the facts of this case, I think initially where the state wants to start is the state wants to talk about the relationships that existed between the parties. Aisha Langford, who the court recognizes, is the mother of C.S., who was 13 at the time of this incident and the oldest sibling of Breasia, as well as being the mother of D.L., who was the youngest sibling of Breasia. Essentially what we had in terms of that family relationship was this. Evidence was introduced that Henry Dinkins was not the biological father of Breasia Terrell. Ms. Langford had indicated that when she was 18 or 19 years of age, at that point in time she had already had CS, she had already conceived Breasia Terrell. Breasia was 2 at the time that she met Henry Dinkins. And then by virtue of the relationship that the two of them engaged in, she became pregnant with DL and conceived the child. There was discussion about the nature of the relationship that existed as far as the family dynamics between Mr. Dinkins, Aisha Langford, and the children. And I think what's very interesting to point out is conversations that occurred during the defendant's interview with Detective Obert that actually took on 2 different perspectives relative to the relationship that he shared with Aisha Langford during the initial stages of the interview, and then the relationship that he shared with Aisha Langford toward the latter stages of the interview. But at any rate, here's what we know. Aisha Langford had indicated that when she began dating Mr. Dinkins, she was of the impression that Mr. Dinkins was much younger than he was. He was an individual who had represented himself as being in his late 20s. At some point in time, by virtue of the relationship that she shared with him, she discovered that he was a much older man. She did indicate that he was very much involved in the children's lives during that initial stage of their relationship, but then time passed and that was not how you would characterize the dynamics that existed as far as Mr. Dinkins having contact with any of the 3 children on a regular basis, or being a father who was actively involved in DL's life. Aisha Langford, in helping us understand what that relationship was, very simply she indicated that he was an individual that when he got a new car or a new girlfriend, he would show up to show off. That being said, let's go ahead and let's set the stage for what occurred during the summer of 2020. During the month of June, and at this point in time, Breasia is 10 years of age. Aisha had talked about how there had been a cookout that had taken place down by the river, I believe. She had attended the cookout with the children. That was her first opportunity to meet Andrea Culberson, who was Mr. Dinkins' girlfriend. That this was an event that Mr. Dinkins was present at, and I believe, but I would ask the courts to draw on its own recollection, I believe that he was the individual who was in charge of the cookout. At any rate, you have what would be a scenario where there's more recent contact that had occurred, where Mr. Dinkins then is a father figure that DL has had contact with in June, and then as of July 8th of 2020, as Ms. Langford indicated, when they were driving down the street with DL in the car, they happened to observe Mr. Dinkins pull into a quick shop. At that point in time, DL expressed an interest in being able to talk with his father and see his father, which prompted Ms. Langford to pull into the quick shop and have a conversation with Mr. Dinkins about how he needed to be more involved in his son's life and he needed to spend time with his son. As a result of that conversation, we know that the discussion opened up to Mr. Dinkins taking DL on July 9th so that he could spend some time with his son. And then throughout the course of July 9th, through telephone records, the court was able to see that there was various contacts that had occurred, but at any rate, we know that, I should say July 8th, let me correct that, on July 9th, that was the date that Mr. Dinkins picked DL up. Now, on July 9th, Aisha Langford was at work. She was working at Checkers there on East Locust Street. And so as a mother Her understanding of what was to transpire was very simply that Mr. Dinkins was going to respond over to her mother's house, pick up DL, and take his son, his biological son, and spend time with him. When Mr. Dinkins arrived there at the residence of Danita Gardner, who is the biological grandmother, the situation changed. And as far as the events that developed there at the Gardner residence, Ms. Gardner described how she had been in a back room when Mr. Dinkins got there, when he came inside the residence and he was going to be gathering up his sons to leave. The conversation developed into Breasia being interested and wanting to come along. Aisha Langford had described that Breasia and DL were very, very close as siblings, and quite honestly, they were attached at the hip, and it would not have been a surprise to her that DL would want his sister to go along with him. And so the conversation developed wherein Mr. Dinkins had consented to Breasia coming along, but what was very interesting about that conversation is this. CS, the 13-year-old child and the teenager out of the group, wanted to be able to come along, and Mr. Dinkins would not allow him to accompany DL and his sister. Danita Gardner, during her testimony, spoke to that particular issue, as she spoke to the fact that Aisha had no idea that Breasia actually ended up leaving her residence and accompanying Mr. Dinkins, but at any rate, that prompted a telephone call wherein Miss Gardner had advised her daughter that Breasia actually was going to go and spend time with Mr. Dinkins, her younger brother, and that once she got off work, she would need to pack up clothing to take over to the apartment that Mr. Dinkins shared with Andrea Culberson there at Jersey Meadows apartment, which we now know as apartment number 8. Aisha Langford, she gets off work. She goes to her mother's residence, and I think one of the things that is important for purposes of discussion is this. We know that Aisha and her children were in a transition period. They were in the process of having moved from a prior residence, and she had the children's items back boxed up. So when she went to her mother's residence, she got together clothing for Breasia, she got together clothing for DL, and within that clothing, she packed pajamas for both of the children to wear. Additionally, there was footwear that would have gone over to the residence. And then once she had accomplished that task, she drove over to the Jersey Meadow apartment complex to drop the clothing off. Now, before we go further into a discussion about those particular details, I think it's important to stop and talk about Breasia as a child. One of the things that the state had talked with Aisha Langford about was whether or not Jersey Meadows apartment complex was a location that this child was familiar with, that either child was familiar with. And she indicated that no, this was the first time that the children had ever been to this apartment complex. This was not an apartment complex that Breasia was familiar with. This was not an apartment complex that there were family members who lived at. This was not an apartment complex that Breasia had friends that she knew. And the reason that I bring that issue up is that I think it's very relevant to considering what happened in the middle of the night when Andrea Culberson woke up and found that Breasia was gone from the apartment. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. But I think that we've got to stop and we've got to consider these circumstances, because in conjunction with that conversation, one of the conversations that occurred with Aisha Langford on the stand is a conversation about the personality of Breasia. Was Breasia the type of child who was prone to waking up in the middle of the night and wandering off? Aisha described her children as being very sound sleepers. And the grandmother even spoke to that particular issue. And that once she went down, that child went down. But the other thing about Breasia was a rule follower. She was not the type of child who would just get up and leave on her own. But even more importantly, Breasia was not the type of child who's going to get up in the middle of the night and leave an apartment in an apartment complex that she's not familiar with and just to wander off. There was discussion during the course of the testimony, and I would ask the court to draw on its own recollection about this particular topic. But I believe both Aisha and Danita Gardner spoke to this, that Breasia was not a child who liked to go out in the dark. Now, Breasia was 10. You consider a 10-year-old child in an environment that they are not familiar with. And what's the likelihood that a child is going to get up in the middle of the night and just wander off? Beyond that, Breasia had some issues with her sight. Breasia had some issues with her hearing. But then even taking that a step further, the discussion that occurred was a description of her personality, because the state thought that this was very important. What type of child is Breasia? And the one thing that Aisha talked about, and even the grandmother had talked about, is that Breasia was a truth teller. She was a child that would tell the truth no matter what. And I think her grandmother's description was, she described her as a tattletale. And so if her older brother or her younger brother were doing things that she didn't think was appropriate, Breasia was a child who was going to tell. And I think that that particular personality attribute is something that has significant bearing on the events that played out through the course of the night of July 10th and going to the early morning hours of July 10th of 2020. Taking that and setting that discussion aside, I want to jump over to the interview of Mr. Dinkins. When Detective Obert met with him at the Davenport Police Department after Mr. Dinkins arrived there sometime around noon. Now, in that opening interview, the court had the opportunity to observe the conversation Mr. Dinkins engaged in with Detective Obert, describing the family dynamic. Because at that point in time, essentially what we have, in terms of the perspective of law enforcement, is we have a child who is missing. And so the focus of that investigation is to try and gather any information that they could about family relationships and this child and a timeline of events so that the information could be utilized to develop a plan to go out and search areas where Breasia might possibly be. During the context of that discussion about the family dynamics, Henry Dinkins portrayed himself as a father figure to Breasia, how he considered her to be his daughter. And when you hear those types of statements being made in the interview, it creates its own impression. It creates the impression that we have a man who is very much a part of this family's life. It creates an impression that we have a man who is probably exercising regular visitation, is probably a figure within this family's life, on any day through any given week. And so when you create that impression, what it does is it lends itself to perception, all right? And here's what I mean by that. When you stop to think about the human experience and relationships that any of us have with individuals, depending upon the length of that relationship, depending upon the character of that relationship, the amount of contact that occurs in that relationship, that forms perceptions. So you may think that you know an individual, but if you have a lot of contact with that individual, that tends to create a sense of trust. And we form perceptions about that, and that is the basis by which we determine whether or not we feel comfortable around this individual, whether or not we trust this individual, whether or not we trust this individual around our children and would feel comfortable with that individual spending time with our children. So Mr. Dinkins, when he's talking about, how he perceives himself as a father figure to Breasia, we're left with the impression that this is an individual who is very much involved in Breasia's life. And that being said, this is an individual as a father figure who would never do anything to hurt that child. Mr. Dinkins talked about how close he was with Aisha and how they had a very good working relationship together as far as co-parenting. But then when you get to the latter stages of the interview, the complexion of those comments changes drastically. And he describes how they have a very contentious relationship, how they really don't speak at all, and that's in stark contrast with what he would have led Detective Obert to believe during the initial stages. And that particular statement is in keeping with what Aisha Langford testified to about the family dynamic. And I think if we understand what the family dynamic is, it really speaks to comfort levels having an adult male who really isn't a father figure to Breasia, getting up in the middle of the night and removing this child from the apartment without communicating with his girlfriend about their departure, not communicating with Aisha Langford about the departure, and not offering any explanation as to a legitimate reason for leaving the apartment complex. So that dynamic is very, very important. Now let's go back then and let's talk about how the events developed during the evening of July 9th. You know that once Aisha went back to her mother's, she packed up clothing for the children, and she went over to the apartment complex. Breasia came down, was very happy. You know, the evening was going very well. There was the puppy that had come with Aisha. Breasia was excited about that. And then there was the handoff of the clothing with the mother, you know, letting her child know that she loves her. Mom leaves. And as Aisha is driving west on 53rd, we know that the weather is such that it begins to rain. And it's a significant rain. So much so that Ms. Langford described how she had to pull over into a driveway over near North High because her windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the amount of rain that was coming down. The state brought that testimony out because it becomes very significant to later findings that were made when the maroon Chevy Impala was lifted on that hoist so that the gas tank could be dropped to measure the amount of gasoline. That rain explains soil conditions that would have existed over in the area of Kunau Implement, where Breasia's remains were later recovered 6 months later. And it was because of that rain, and even discussions with other law enforcement officers who talked about the weather conditions throughout the night of July 10th. And when I talk about throughout the night, I'm talking about after the midnight hour, transitioning from July 9th into July 10th, and going to the morning hours of July 10th. So we've got that significant rainfall. We have a mother then who returns back to her own mother's apartment. Aisha described being very, very tired, and that essentially what she did was she just lay down on the couch and she fell asleep and she was dead to the world because she was so exhausted. Danita Gardner was asked about that same circumstance, and she also talked about how her daughter lay down on the couch and went to sleep. Now, as far as the plans for July 10th, Aisha was to work. Her typical scheduled shift, she would have gone in at 11, but because one of her coworkers hadn't come in to work, that prompted her manager to call her before the 8 o'clock hour and ask her to come in because he needed somebody there to cover for that coworker who had called in. And so Aisha left her mother's residence, had gone into work. As far as any contact that had occurred between Aisha and her children, we know the last point of direct contact was when she dropped the clothing off to Aisha. And then through the phone records, we know that Bree had been utilizing Mr. Dinkins' phone because neither child had cell phones that would have gone to that apartment. And there was the communications where there were a call or two, I don't remember right now, but the records will speak to that. Aisha was asleep, she didn't answer that, but then there was the text message that came through about something like, "Good night, Mama, I love you," and then Aisha responding back later in the evening that she loved, the two of the children and wishing them a good night. So the mother goes to sleep. Everything seemed fine. There would be no reason for concern or worry. What happens then? Let's talk about the dynamics of what's occurring from the perspective of DL, Breasia, Mr. Dinkins, and Andrea Culberson. So, when Mr. Dinkins picked the children up, we know that he went over to the 700 block of Taylor Street. That's one of the things that the officers had talked about, where he went to a relative's house, Vince Howard. The children hung out there with a couple of little girls. There were the adult male figures that were there. The children were playing video games. And then after that visit concluded, the three subjects, Mr. Dinkins, Breasia, and DL, went over to Andrea Culberson's apartment. That's the apartment that Mr. Dinkins shared with Andrea Culberson. Now, I want to talk about the visit to Taylor Street, and here's why. You know, when we stop and consider the testimony that came out through the course of this trial, as far as individuals who could provide statements about what happened during the middle of the night of July 10th at apartment number 8 there at the Jersey Meadow apartment complex, we have an 8-year-old child, and then we have Andrea Culberson, the adult. There's been a lot of discussion, about a child who's 8 years old and their ability to be able to recollect events, to be able to sequence those events, to be able to understand even what's going on. And during the course of interviews that you conduct of an 8-year-old, why is it that if you do an initial sit-down with a child provides some details, but then when you extend that out, then the child is able to bring about more details. The point that the state is going to make about DL is this. Everything that child described happening in his interviews formed the investigative construct for steps taken by officers of the Davenport Police Department in the investigation that they conducted. So, Mr. Dinkins, in his interview, after he picks up the children, describes having gone over to Vince Howard's house where the children played video games. That is absolutely consistent with what DL said. DL didn't know his father's friend's name, but he described going over to this house and spending time. Through the course of the investigation, one of the things that was talked about through the testimony, I believe, of Detective Obert, but I will ask the court to draw on its own recollection about this particular topic, that was an issue that was followed up by law enforcement. And Detective Obert did speak to this, because Detective Obert and Detective Ann Siebert went over to Vince Howard's house on Taylor Street. Detective Siebert was that direct point of contact. Detective Obert was following some issues down, but they verified that, yes, the children were there at the Howard residence, as Mr. Dinkins described, and as DL described. So then, when we go to the apartment complex, let's do the comparison between what Andrea Culberson describes happening and what DL describes what's happening. At no point in time is there ever any type of divergence in what it is that both parties relate. Andrea, we know, works for AT&T. Andrea works from home, and Andrea still was working her shift and didn't get off until 7-something in the evening. Andrea has her workstation set up in the bedroom. She described how Breasia was fascinated by the work that she was doing and wanted to learn. So the two spent some time, bonding in that respect. And that was even something that Breasia was very excited to share with her mother. I bring that up because we're looking at issues of credibility throughout all of the testimony that was offered. And the one point that the state would definitely make is you see no discrepancies in testimony or statements provided by DL, or in testimony or statements offered by Andrea Culberson, and even like a small tangential issue like that relative to Aisha Langford and what she described happening. So, the children are there in the apartment. We know the apartment is very small. We know that it is an upper-level apartment that has its own staircase dedicated to the apartment itself. So you come in that door, you go up the stairs. When you get to the top of the stairs, and as you get to the top of the stairs and you look over to your left, that's the main living area. We know it's just kind of an open area where we've got the living room, kitchen combination. And then we know if you were standing at the top of the staircase and you were looking at the wall ahead of you, basically you go just a little bit further toward the living room kitchen area. We've got that door that leads into the only bedroom that's there in that apartment. And interestingly enough about that, you have to access that bedroom to go to the bathroom. And the other point of interest is this. The bedroom window itself actually faces out onto the parking lot. So the court had the ability to see the orientation of how you would access apartment number 8. In order to get to apartment number 8, you had to go along the east side of the property, which essentially lies to the west of Costco. So it's back along that wooded line that separates the property of Costco to the back of Jersey Meadows. That window in the bedroom looks out onto the parking lot, and the court certainly understands the import of that. Throughout the night, Mr. Dinkins agrees with this, Andrea agrees with this, DL talks about this. DL's playing video games in the living room. Breasia is in the bedroom, and she's playing her own video game. DL, as an 8-year-old child, brings that issue up because he is there to spend time with his father. But he notes his father is spending time in the bedroom with Breasia as she's playing a video game. And Andrea Culberson gives us a little bit more perspective because she talks about how the three of them are sitting on the bed and they're playing some type of game where they're passing back and forth. But you have a father who's supposed to be spending time with his son, and he makes the choice to spend time in the bedroom with this 10-year-old little girl. And what we saw during the interview of DL, that bothered him, and it made him mad because his father was supposed to be spending time with him, but his father was making the choice to spend time with his sister. At any rate, we know that at some point during the course of the evening, the children take the showers. There's complete agreement on that particular topic. We know that they have dinner. We know that rather than the children dressing in the pajamas that Aisha had brought over, Mr. Dinkins selected large white T-shirts for the two children to wear. Now, why? Mr. Dinkins' T-shirt is a 4XL. Why would you want to put a 4XL on a 10-year-old child? It makes no sense. But when you think about that article of clothing, men's white T-shirts are very common articles of clothing. And knowing what occurred to Breasia, if Breasia were dressed in her own clothing, and we know that those clothes were later returned to Aisha, who went through those clothing, that bag of clothing, actually ended up being 2 bags of clothing, when they returned, she went through that clothing to try and identify what articles of clothing were missing, and there wasn't any missing. If Breasia had been dressed in her own little clothes, and Aisha did that inventory, she could say to law enforcement, these articles of clothing didn't come back. But Breasia is dressed in this white large t-shirt and her little black shorts and her little sports bra. So, DL and Andrea Culberson, again, are absolutely consistent on what happened. Breasia goes to bed first. Andrea lays down on that air mattress in the living room where she and Mr. Dinkins were to sleep. She goes down sometime around 11 o'clock. She hears Mr. Dinkins say to DL, you've got till a little after 12 to finish playing that video game, and you're going down to bed. DL indicates that his father's the third to go to sleep, and then he is the fourth individual to go to sleep. DL and Andrea both describe DL sleeping at the foot of the bed. And Breasia is up toward the top of the bed. Now, why do I even focus on that detail? Because, again, we're looking at an 8-year-old child who is providing information about activities. And everything that that child describes is in complete agreement with what is described by the adult in that apartment complex. All right, so then the question, very simply, is this. What happened after everyone went to sleep? We know definitively what happened in that apartment at 3 o'clock. We know that Andrea woke up to go to the bathroom. She noted Henry Dinkins wasn't there. She walks into the bedroom. She doesn't have her glasses on, but Breasia is not up there on the right side of the bed. DL is still down at the base of the bed, asleep. Andrea goes to the bathroom, thinks, let me get my glasses on to make sure that I'm seeing what I'm seeing. She puts her glasses on. Breasia's not there. She checks throughout the apartment. Breasia's not there. Andrea Culberson is very clear. At no point in time did Mr. Dinkins ever wake her up and indicate that he was going to be leaving that apartment with Breasia, that there was a potential medical emergency, that he had to take her to the hospital, that maybe the child was missing her mother and wanted to go home. There were no communications whatsoever. Andrea Culberson did not feel comfortable at all with her discovery. Now, Andrea Culberson testified she'd been involved in a relationship with Mr. Dinkins for 6 years, and she is not feeling comfortable at all. She feels so uncomfortable, she tells or describes for the court in her testimony that she didn't even want to think about the possibilities of why Mr. Dinkins was gone and why Breasia was gone. But she's so unsettled, rather than going to bed, she chooses to sit up in the living room in the dark to wait for Mr. Dinkins' return. She tried reaching out to contact him, but found that his cell phone was there in the apartment. She talked about it charging, but then the question was also asked, is Mr. Dinkins the type of individual that goes around without his phone? And she said, no, he's not. Recognizing that the phone was plugged into a charger, this takes us to the photographs of the maroon Chevy Impala. And the court has had the opportunity to observe photographs that has that white aux cord and another cord that could be used for charging cell phones. But that phone is there in the apartment, and the state asserts that that is significant. Why? Because cell phones are devices that document the location of where that phone has traveled to. If an individual is abducting a child from an apartment complex, the last thing that you want is a digital device on your person to document locations that you are going, because that provides leads to law enforcement, and those leads then can be utilized to determine what had occurred. So the phone's there in the apartment. Aisha Langford gives us a very definitive time of 3:30, based on the clock on her desk. She said she's sitting there in the dark. Mr. Dinkins very quietly unlocks the door and very quietly comes up the stairs into the apartment in such a way so as not to awake anyone. Mr. Dinkins, of course, was not anticipating that Andrea Culberson would be up and would have discovered that both he and Breasia were gone from the apartment. Now, I'm going to step outside this conversation. I want to take us to the time frame of 8:55 in the morning of the Jersey Meadow apartment complex, when Officer Burkle had responded to that location. In Mr. Dinkins' conversations with Officer Burkle, he created the impression that he wasn't familiar with this apartment complex and didn't even live there. And if the court will go back and reflect to the video footage that was collected from Officer Burkle's body-worn camera, Officer Burkle had said, you know, I know this sounds strange, but oftentimes when children come up missing, if law enforcement goes in and we do a search, we end up finding the children in closets or under the beds. Would you mind if I went into the apartment and conducted a search? What was Mr. Dinkins' response? We've already searched the area. Officer Burkle persists. So Henry Dinkins then goes over to apartment 8, and rather than walking into that apartment, where he clearly lives, as described by Andrea Culberson, and he even has a closet that contains only his clothing, he knocks there at the door, as if he would simply be a guest, and he would have to wait for the tenant of that apartment to come down and answer the door. Miss Culberson comes down the stairs. Officer Burkle's right there at that front door. He has the conversation with Miss Culberson about being able to go in and search, and explained, you know, he had lost his own children like a child the week before. She's very hesitant. She looks out the door. Mr. Dinkins isn't right there by Officer Burkle. He's several feet down the sidewalk near the corner of the building. Miss Culberson looks out and says, is it okay with him? As if she's got to get permission. And Officer Burkle says yes. And then she says, well, the apartment's a mess. The court had an opportunity to see the apartment. Quite honestly, it wasn't a mess. And then Officer Burkle goes up. Breasia's not there, but Henry Dinkins leaves the apartment complex, and nobody can find him. All right? So, let's go back into the equation of the discussion that we had. Andrea makes it known to Mr. Dinkins that she is awake, and she knows he's gone, and she knows Breasia's gone. Mr. Dinkins is not responding in any way to give information to her about what is going on. He goes into the bedroom to his closet, and he digs in the closet. The court's been able to see the relationship of the bed to the closet on what would be the right side of that bed. Andrea Culberson describes going to the window, looking out onto the parking lot, and there the maroon Chevy Impala is parked. Breasia is standing right next to the passenger side of that vehicle. There's no question in her mind that it's Breasia. She talked about how she has very distinctive hair, but also she talked about how the child had been dressed in this white big T-shirt of Mr. Dinkins. Breasia's there. She can't see what Mr. Dinkins is getting out of his closet, but he puts it away in his clothing in such a way that she doesn't know what he's gotten out of the closet. Now, to take the court's attention back to testimony that she had offered here in court, and also testimony that DL had offered here in court, they both talked about how he had been wearing a black shirt. I throw that out because that is consistent with what Jared Brink had testified to when he had the contact with that black male subject over there on Highway 61, and then when he drove him over to the area of 270th Avenue. I also bring that up for this reason. There was much ado being made about the fact that Mr. Dinkins was wearing that white T-shirt, a man's undershirt that had no sleeves on it, when we see him going into the quick shop and leaving. But then Mr. Brink is describing the black male subject having on some type of black shirt. The state went to photographs taken of articles removed from that vehicle. What do we see? We see an article of black clothing that had been taken out of the front passenger compartment. We also see a box of clothing in the rear portion of that trunk. To be able to pull an article of clothing out, put it on, take it off, is something that's very easy to do. But I bring that up because I think it's very important to mention before the state forgets that. So then, when Mr. Dinkins goes down that staircase, Andrea Culberson looks out, the Impala's gone, Mr. Dinkins gone, and Breasia's gone. She was asked specifically when she looked out and saw Breasia there, did you see any activity in the parking lot? None. Any individuals around? None. Those questions were asked because the assertion being from defense is that if Andrea did not see Mr. Dinkins get into that Impala, if Andrea did not see Breasia get into that Impala, then there's no evidence to show that Breasia was with Henry Dinkins, and the state absolutely disagrees with that. That sequence of events and the observations of Andrea Culberson absolutely answers that question. Mr. Dinkins left Jersey Meadow apartment complex with Breasia in the car, and we know that Breasia is still alive at 3:30. But what has happened before 3:30 and before Andrea's discovery that Breasia is missing? DL gives us a perspective. He talks about being asleep. He talks about how he's kicked very hard by his sister. There was a discussion about, is this simply a sibling who's rolling around, and maybe they touched. No, this was different. This hurt. And then DL, while he didn't recollect that during his testimony, when he was interviewed on June 10th, described noticing his sister missing, hearing his father's voice, peeking out the bedroom, and seeing his father go down those stairs with Breasia and talking with her about cars. An interesting point that the child brings up when Aisha Langford says that Mr. Dinkins only comes around when he gets a new car or he gets a new girlfriend. So, what's happened between or before 3 a.m.? So between the time that everybody's gone down to bed, with DL being the last individual in that house to fall asleep, what has happened between that time frame and 3 o'clock when Andrea makes the discovery? Now, before I talk about this, I've got a demonstrative exhibit that actually is a collection of still images that were a part of exhibits the state has introduced. But, Your Honor, just for purposes of perspective, let's go back down and let's just discuss the area of Schmidt Road and Credit Island if we can. We know that River Drive is our southernmost east-west street. And we know that the area that we're going to be talking about where Mr. Dinkins' RV is parked and Credit Island, that's in an area of town that's more industrial in nature. And so during this time of night, in the middle of the night, there's not a lot of activity there, okay? So we know that Credit Island is on the south side of River Drive. We know that the southernmost point will be the Mississippi River that runs east and west along that area. We know that Schmidt Road, if you come out of Credit Island and you turn right or travel east, Schmidt Road essentially is about 400 meters. So the distance of one lap around the track. And I think that that was a very good way of describing it, so that the court would understand the closeness of both entry points, so that the court will understand it takes very little time to travel from Schmidt Road to enter onto Credit Island. Now, Schmidt Road, we know, is a north-south street. At the southernmost point, this is where you turn onto River Drive. It's not a very long street, because then at its northern point, it turns onto Rockingham, which is our east-west street. And we know if we go further east, it turns into 2nd. Hy-Vee is our most western point on Rockingham that has video surveillance feed that gives us information about what happened after the trip to Clinton that morning. Then we know that Purina is a factory that is there at the corner of Rockingham and Schmidt Road. It lies on the eastern side of Rockingham and Schmidt. We know if you go from north to south on the east side, we've got Purina. We've got 743 Schmidt Road. That is that area where individuals can store their vehicles. We know that that's where Mr. Dinkins' RV was stored. And then we know then Jack's Break and Alignment is the southernmost building there. We've got video surveillance equipment on Jack's Break and Alignment, and this is a constant feed, so it never stops. We know at Hy-Vee it's a constant feed. We know at Purina it's a constant feed. But then to the east of both 743 Schmidt and Jack's Break and Alignment, we have Devon Self-Storage. We've got cameras affixed to this building, but they're only motion activated. All right. So those are our variables that we're working with. And then we know over here on River Drive, just to the west of Credit Island, if you come out of Credit Island and you look across the street, if you go down there and you ride your bike, you know, and you're familiar with the bike path down there, there's the bait shop. And then a couple of houses over is Sarah Lowe's residence. Her video surveillance equipment is fixed to the front of the house. And so then we know that in terms of the angle of that camera feed, it shows us that entry point onto Credit Island. So that sets our perspective there, and we understand the relationship of the cameras and activity and how that activity would have been picked up. All right, let's go to the state's first demonstrative exhibit. Now, as we read this, Your Honor, we're going to read from left to right. At 2:13 a.m., we see a vehicle, and it's a sedan, it's not a pickup, it's not a van, it's not an RV. We see a passenger vehicle traveling north on Schmidt Road. Let's stop and think about this. So what would be the most direct route of travel down to River Drive? If you leave that apartment complex, you travel down 53rd, heading west. You get on I-74, heading south. You exit on River Drive, heading west, and that will take you out to the area of Schmidt Road and Credit Island. So it makes sense that that vehicle is heading north because it's turned from River Drive heading north. That is at 2:13 a.m. I would ask the court to pay attention to the shape of what we see, the outline or the contours of this particular vehicle. Because when you stop and consider those contours and the shape, and you look at what we've seen about that vehicle when we've seen it during the daylight hours, and how it seems like it just kind of slopes down a little bit toward the front, and maybe there's a bit of an elevation toward the rear, this is exactly consistent with that. So that vehicle is heading north at 2:13 a.m. Now, at Devon Self-Storage, we see Mr. Dinkins' RV right here. And we see a vehicle departing the lot at 2:29. So, between 2:13 and 2:29, we're talking about a time frame of 16 minutes roughly. Okay? Then, we go down and we see that vehicle south on Schmidt Road, and look at the shape of the vehicle. It is similar. That's at 2:30. Then the vehicle turns around at 2:31 going back north. So something is happening that makes that vehicle turn around within a time frame of a minute. So at 2:31 it's going back north on Schmidt Road. Then we have the camera at Devon Self-Storage motion activated, and we can see the vehicle now leaving the area of Mr. Dinkins' motorhome at 2:49. This particular video feed, when the court had the ability to observe it up on the screen, we got a better perspective of what type of vehicle was leaving that lot. And it was consistent with a passenger vehicle. So 2:49, it's leaving. Then we've got it south on Schmidt Road at 2:50. So between 2:31 and 2:49, we're talking about 18 minutes. 18 minutes back in that area, plus an additional 16 minutes. So what's that giving us? That's giving us 34 minutes. What is going on in this RV over the course of 34 minutes? The court knows that this particular RV is not equipped for anybody to live there. There was no food in the refrigerator. There is no way to hook that RV up to water or anything at all. There certainly were personal items that were being stored there. There's a bed there that has bedding on it. There's clothing and shoes and things like that. And this is a location that is attributable to being Mr. Dinkins' RV. But then, when it leaves south on Schmidt Road, it goes on to Credit Island, entering Credit Island at 2:51. And then leaving Credit Island at 2:53. All right. That was a topic of discussion that came up with Detective Obert. And what was going on in this area of town. And I would ask the court to draw on its own recollection about how they were focusing on any type of cell activity to determine whether or not there was activity in that area with other individuals. And there was. So, there's two photographs that I want to point out to the court. The top photograph is the perspective of the camera angle when law enforcement got in with a search warrant, where we can see that bed, and then right there on a wooden box we have a cleaning product, and as the court can see, that cleaning product has bleach within it. This trial has spoken very extensively about the import of bleach. Bleach destroys DNA. The state finds it very significant that you've got a cleaning product right there by that bed. And the state finds it very significant that relative to all of the articles of evidence that were sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, or even the DCI laboratory, no DNA on anything. It was actually clean. Isn't that what we would expect to find if an individual has the knowledge base to recognize the import of bleach and its ability to kill DNA? And we have that there, but we also have that as a product that Mr. Dinkins has purchased a little after 7 a.m. in Clinton. The state also points out this machete that was above the microwave. If the court looks very closely at those photographs, one of the things that the child talked about is how his father had wiped that machete down with a rag. The court can see the fibers within this machete. We had our analyst come in from Quantico who testified to that, and she did indicate, Linda Otterstatter, I believe it was, she did indicate that there were fibers within that. It didn't match a white and pink and I think purple striped cloth that was in the console of the Impala, and it didn't match that white washcloth that went back with the children's clothing. But through the testimony, we know that there was a white washcloth at Andrea's that had been used to clean off Breasia's feet because they'd gotten muddy, all right? And so it didn't match. But the point being, the child had described it being wiped down, and he talked about there being bleach. Now, moving beyond that. So, this is all the activity that happens even before Mr. Dinkins returns to apartment 8. This evidence here speaks to what Mr. Dinkins' intent was. For him to take that 10-year-old child from this apartment in the middle of the night and take her over to this area of town to an RV speaks to his intent. And the state asserts, when you consider these circumstances and you consider the purchase of bleach and the use of bleach, this child was sexually assaulted in this area. But then it became very clear to Mr. Dinkins that there was going to be no way for him to control this child. And so therefore, it forced him to take further action, which was the murdering of Breasia Terrell. And so his returning to the apartment complex at 3:30, the item that he got, the state asserts, is a gun. Now, let's go ahead and let's talk about the sequence of events from 3 a.m. to 3:45 a.m., which really speak to the issue of his intent, his premeditation, and the fact that he was going to deliberately and willfully murder this child. After 3:30 a.m., and 3:30 a.m. is measured by the clock in Andrea's apartment. We know that he went to the Quick Shop on 53rd Street. The counters are 2 minutes off. So we see, based on its date of 7/10/2020, that Impal is entering at 3:30. It's actually 3:32 a.m. in the morning. We see Mr. Dinkins pull up to the gas pump. As the court can see, the dark tint on those windows precludes anyone from being able to look into the vehicle to see what was going on. But when he gets out of the car and he walks into the store, he's got that lanyard with his keys on him. He goes into the store, he makes the purchases. One of the things that is noted through testimony is the number of times that he kept looking out to that car. Now, if you pull up to a gas pump in the middle of the night, and you have concerns about someone, potentially getting in your car and stealing it and leaving it, well, there's two ways to deal with that. You lock it, and in this particular case, we know that Mr. Dinkins didn't leave his keys in the car because we've got that lanyard with him and those keys. He's gone in, he looks out the car, it's very clear that he's very interested in that vehicle, and then when he goes to the pump, he gets in the car after he starts pumping gas, and he gets out after it's concluded. Why did Mr. Dinkins need to fill up with a full tank of gas? The receipt was introduced. He purchased $34 worth of gas. What's a very important point to discuss here at this juncture is the fact that he presented a $100 bill. And then he got $40-some back. I'm not quite sure what that figure is. I bring that up because then we need to go full circle back to his interview with Detective Obert. When he was asked by Detective Obert what his activities consisted during the middle of the night of July 10th, he acknowledged that he left the apartment 3 times. So would have left and came back. He said that he went over to Vince Howard's house, knocked on the door, nobody was there, he came back. Then he indicated that he wasn't sure, wouldn't give us a time frame, but he was out of money. He only had a couple of dollars, and he may have gone over to his RV to get some money. Clearly, he didn't need money because he was able to present a $100 bill there at the Quick Shop, and he still had $40-some after he made the purchases in addition to the gas, and then he was able to make the purchase there at the Walmart in Clinton after 7 a.m. of over $8. But then I would also note that even when Jared Brink pulled him out, he was offering him $100. So that's very relevant because it goes to the issue of credibility. The other issue I think that really falls within the context of this discussion is the fact that Mr. Dinkins will never, ever provide a timeline for anything that he did. He's given Google Maps to draw locations where he said that he has gone, bearing in mind his first telephone call to Aisha Langford was this: "I just woke up and Breasia's gone." We know that the text came in at 8:08 a.m. Aisha was at work, she just checked in, she returns the call, and then we've got a series of calls after that where his first representation is, "I just woke up and Breasia's gone." That certainly is not in accord with what all of the other witnesses have testified to. At any rate, we know he leaves at 3:38 a.m., and then a particular import is mile marker 124 at 3:44 and again at 3:45 when Detective Obert looked at the video surveillance feed from the DOT. It showed a sedan passing. Now, we can't see what it is, but those variables are very important, particularly when we go to what happened with Jared Brink. And then we throw those time variables into the time variable of what was determined up in the area of Kuhnau Implement. So, what definitively ties Mr. Dinkins to the area of Kuhnau Implement during the early morning hours of July 10th, where Breasia's remains were located? The court has heard deposition testimony, and then the court had the opportunity to watch the video surveillance, or not the video surveillance, the interview of Jared Brink. Jared Brink, we know, lives somewhere further north and to the east of Kuhnau Implement. We know that Jared Brink works at Linwood Mining here in Scott County, so essentially what he's got to do is he's got to travel from Clinton County. The most direct route would quite honestly be I-80 down along the 280 to get off in the area of River Drive so that you could go to Buffalo where Linwood Mining is at. He describes his morning routine. He gets up, he gets dressed, he gets his cup of coffee, he gets on the road, and he heads out. Mr. Brink had indicated that when he was on Highway 61, and this is where we have a plot pointed, he was traveling south, and a black male waved him down who was standing along the side of the road. This black male subject he described as wearing a dark shirt. Interestingly enough, he describes the black male as being more muscular, but when he saw the back image of Mr. Dinkins leaving the quick shop, he only had on that T-shirt that completely exposed his arms and showed a form-fitting T-shirt on his body. He indicated that this individual was more muscular in terms of what he could see. He described him wearing a black hat, which is exactly what DL described in his interview about how his father had a do-rag on and how he had a cap on. He described this individual as having jewelry on. That's exactly what DL described his father wearing when we got to see his interviews yesterday. But even more importantly, he described the subject wearing a white denim type of short that had some type of screen imprint on it, and he remembers there being blue. And when he was shown the rear image of Mr. Dinkins leaving the quick shop, he said, "Those are the shorts." Jared Brink also described this black male subject as having a mole on the right side of his nose, and the court had the opportunity to see the press release that the Davenport Police Department had prepared and had put out. And sure enough, what do we have? We have Mr. Dinkins with that mole right beside his nose. At any rate, he stopped there. They go over to the area of 270th Avenue, and the vehicle is perpendicular across 270th Avenue, as if it tried doing a three-point turn, but the rear wheels went off the shoulder, which the court knows is a steep incline, to the west, and it got stuck. And so he had to pull the vehicle out. The vehicle that he describes is a maroon Chevy Impala. He describes the interior as being tan. He thought it was leather. But at any rate, he also described it being clean and there being that white aux cord. That's an exact match to what we have in this particular case, Your Honor. Everything that he described matched Henry Dinkins to a T. And then we know, based on his cell phone pinging, And then I'm going to have the court look up there because I can't tell it. Maybe you can see it on the screen. But I think his phone, Mr. Brink's cell phone, is hitting off that cell phone tower in the area of Kunow Implement, directionally toward the area of Kunow Implement at 4:27 a.m. in the morning. So, we've got the cell phone hitting there. We've got the area that is shown, number one, up here, where that contact occurred on Highway 61. When we go to the map of 270th Avenue, where the vehicle was perpendicular across the road, that's the location that Mr. Brink had noted when he was shown those maps by Detective Sean Johnson. And then you take that and you overlay it with the locations that Special Agent McMillan had collected soil samples from after Breasia's body was recovered, and the GPS coordinates. We know of the 10 soil samples, 3 of those were inclusive of soil samples on Mr. Dinkins' vehicle. There were a total of 4 soil samples taken from the undercarriage. 3 toward the rear, those were matches. 1 toward the driver's side, toward the front of the vehicle, which was not a match. That is conclusive. Then we go back to the Impala, and let's talk about the Impala. When Mr. Dinkins presented himself to the Davenport Police Department, there's any number of areas that you could park right there in front of the department and walk in. When he was being interviewed by Detective Obert, he initially presents himself as having been dropped off and that his vehicle was mobile and that a friend had it, but didn't want to give any information about who that friend was. Then Detective Obert discerned that maybe he might have some issues with his license, and that might be why he's reluctant. He says, I'm not concerned about that at all. You know, the whole thing is about finding Breasia. And Mr. Dinkins still is not willing to give information about where that vehicle is at. By virtue of the bolo that went out, patrol officers received that information over their MDTs. Officer Pojar read that bolo and happened to observe the maroon Chevy Impala parked a block down and to the north, there on Main. And then the vehicle was seized and brought to the Davenport Police Department. Jill Foster took photographs of that vehicle, and this was a topic of conversation that Miss Foster had talked about when we went around the vehicle. There were areas on the vehicle to show that there was the spray of muddy dirt on the vehicle. And you see it along the passenger side here in those areas. The other thing that's interesting about this, and the state's going to bring this back full circle, not only do we have soil around that vehicle that's consistent with it being up in this area, but then the other thing is the child had described how there had been a machete in the trunk of the vehicle, and one of the things that Sergeant Pfeiffer had talked about when they started to remove the remains from Breasia's skeleton, or remove the branches from Breasia's skeletal remains, he noted that it looked like a knife had been used to cut branches to lay over the top of her body. And so the state throws that in there because that yet is another connection to this area up here in the area of Kunow Implement. As for additional identifiers, Mr. Brink picked out a white ox cord. That's exactly what was inside that vehicle when it was seized. Mr. Brink, when shown these photographs, or this photograph of Mr. Dinkins leaving the quick shop, it's an exact match. And of course, we've got the maroon Chevy Impala that he described being shown by Joseph Adams after his wife had sent him the image. He picked out the maroon Chevy Impala, and then we see the photograph of Mr. Dinkins there with the mole on the right side of his face. This takes us to the last portion of the story. And the conduct of Mr. Dinkins speaks about volumes about his involvement in the murder of Breasia. We know sometime after sunrise, according to Detective Hammis's testimony, when she was doing the interview, she'd asked, the cellular device, what time the sun rose. And I think it was like maybe at about 5:38 on June 10th or July 10th. We know that Mr. Dinkins returned to the apartment sometime during the early morning hours. Sometime after sunrise, Andrea Culberson wasn't able to give us that time. But then we know that when he came up, he got DL, he left, he gathered up the children's clothing, which is very interesting, and then he goes to leave without his phone. Andrea Culberson insists that he takes his phone, so he takes it, leaves with the child. She discovers that there's another bag with the children's clothing. She calls him. He comes back. We see his movement through the video surveillance on the feeds. We see that vehicle going past the Quick Star on 53rd. And this is before the 6 o'clock hour. We see it going east on Eastern by virtue of the camera at Judson Court that faces out onto Eastern. Through the cellular data that was provided to us through Special Agent Fennerin, we know that he traveled east on Eastern, north on Eastern, I'm sorry, Your Honor, back east on Veterans Memorial, back south on Jersey Ridge, back to the apartment complex, which is consistent with him picking up the clothes, and then leaving. Then he goes back north on Jersey, and then we've got him at mile marker 124. I will ask the court to rely on its own recollection, but I think that was about 6:11 a.m. We know then that he went to the Walmart in Clinton where he purchased the Clorox, because DL tells us that his father had his cell phone in the cup holder and the battery had been removed. And when his father went into the store, and we know he entered at 7:04 a.m., that he took the battery, put it in to play a video game. When he saw his father coming out, he removed it so he wouldn't get in trouble. It was that event that allowed us to develop what happened out in Clinton. We know then, by virtue of the canvassing and looking for video feed, we saw him coming past Posh Farms, past First State Central Bank, going into Walmart. We saw the video feed at Walmart. We see him going back past First Central State Bank, Posh Farms, and then back along mile marker 124. We know he purchased Clorox. DL described how his father went to two wooded areas. And the one wooded area that he described as there being woods, and then there was a road down and you could see a pond. That's Kunow implement. He described his father getting out of the car, and he described his father having a knife and having wiped it off, and he knew it was Clorox because he could smell the odor of Clorox. When we look at the travel times, if you drove past mile marker 124 and went the speed limit, it would only take you 22 minutes to get on Highway 30 and go past Posh Farms. On the trip out, it was 32 minutes. On the trip back, it was 37 minutes. 15 more minutes on the trip back. And what do we have? When Breasia's remains are recovered, we've got those clothing articles that are recovered, the shorts, the t-shirt, and the little bra. The court had the ability to see those articles of clothing as they were pulled out by Sergeant Pfeiffer. Then the court had the ability to be able to see photographs, but most importantly, the photograph that came from the state medical examiner's office. When you look at those black shorts, and this is what Sergeant Pfeiffer had talked about, there was discoloration in the fabric, and we could very clearly see it based on what the lighting conditions were when that photograph was taken at the state medical examiner's office. And you can see that discoloration. Very significant. If you have a child who has been sexually assaulted, you have the perpetrator's DNA that's present on that child's body. bleach will kill that DNA. Criminalist Stepansky had testified that they had made a judgment call about how they were going to proceed as it relates to the articles of clothing to see if there was bleach. So they noted discoloration on that white t-shirt. They took cuttings, and recognizing that we've got variables that are working against us. Breasia's been out in the elements for a significant period of time. Her body has decomposed. The clothing has been out there in the sun, the wind, the rain, the snow. All of that compromises DNA. But when he went through the series of tests for those cuttings, he noted that Clorox has 4 specific elements. Those 4 elements were noted when the analysis was made of those cuttings. That he described how he used water to try and pull things out of that fabric, to do a pH test with Clorox being basic at 10. This came in at a 7. But he said, bear in mind, water will dilute the pH. And then Clorox, in a color test, will test a dark blue. This came back as a light blue. But bearing in mind, liquid will dilute the color. He couldn't make a conclusive determination, but the findings are very significant when you combine it with everything else that had happened in the defendant's activities in purchasing bleach. And that tells us everything about what was occurring. Mr. Dinkins is very savvy. He knew exactly what it is that he needed to do to destroy the evidence, and steps were taken to do that. And that is conclusively shown by lab report after lab report after lab report that ended up with negative findings. The only thing he couldn't control was the issue of the soil samples underneath his vehicle that ties his vehicles to that area. I think as far as the last points that I would make, and I'm just thinking about different testimony that was offered, I think at this juncture really what it comes down to is this. What caused Breasia's death? We heard testimony that she was shot through her left mandible. It traveled through her C3 and C4, out the back of her neck, and got caught in her little hair. She was shot twice, from front, on the right side of her body, to back, and that's where we see the damage from the bullets in the scapula. And Dr. Cruz, when asked to opine as to the cause of death and manner of death, indicated that she died of gunshot wounds and the manner of death was homicide. And then the final piece of the puzzle comes into play relative to those casings. I shouldn't say casings, those bullets that were found with Breasia's body. There were 3. There was damage to some. However, when Mike Tate, I believe, talked about this, I get Mike Tate and Mike Schmidt mixed up. He talked about how he goes through the process of weighing that ammunition to get a sense of the caliber, and it was .38 caliber ammunition. That gun that was recovered from the pond, there were empty casings within that revolver. It was .38 caliber ammunition. While there was damage to the bullets, there were markings on those bullets that could be compared to the types of markings that would be generated from the Lassier Comanche. And when you stop and consider the manufacturing process and the types of markings that it leaves, it was consistent with that. And when Mike Tate ran the types of guns that could be used to fire this type of ammunition, the Lassier Comanche was on that list. Your Honor, when you go through this entire sequence of events, while most of the evidence is circumstantial, and we do have some direct evidence, the evidence in this case is overwhelming, and the conclusions are clear. The child was taken from that apartment by a man who was not her father. She was taken so that the adult nor her brother would know. She was sexually assaulted, and then that child was murdered. And based on all of this, the state is asking you to find Mr. Dinkins guilty of murder in the first degree and kidnapping in the first degree. Thank you.